You're listening to The Vault, a Forum Communications podcast covering true crime and general intrigue in the Upper Midwest. I'm your host, Trisha Torinskas. On today's episode, we're handing it over to Forum reporter Tracy Briggs to talk about a 1968 fire that destroyed a family's home. 4 people died, but a dramatic act saved the life of a girl who would later capture the hearts of an entire city. Here's Tracy.
Nobody talked. That's how Forum staff writer Mike Leon described the scene on the northern outskirts of town that frigid early morning of January 5th, 1968. It was 1:05 a.m., and the silence was deafening. Brutally cold, brisk southeasterly winds fanned the flames on piles of rubble that, less than an hour earlier, had been home to the sleeping Jenkins family. Now all firefighters could do was stand back, stare, and hope that the fire wouldn't spread. They knew the worst had already happened. When a man asked the firefighters, "Is anyone in there?" he was greeted with silence. It was 6 degrees below zero. The winds gusted to 25 miles per hour, and shock and sadness were setting in. Leon wrote, "The weather was cold. The silence was cold. Colder than your feet in 2-foot drifts undercut with water from the hose. At 1:05 today, it was a fire that held no warmth." The Jenkins home was located at 1113 35th Street North. The 2-story frame house sat just south of 12th Avenue between North Dakota State University and I-29. In 1968, that was the northwest edge of town. The Jenkins were a working-class family. Bernard was a metal cutter at Fargo Iron and Metal Company, while Ellen worked at the nearby Hasty Tasty restaurant. They were parents to 8 children, 5 of whom were still living at home: 17-year-old Kathryn, 12-year-old Steve, 10-year-old Bruce, and 8-year-old Evelyn. An older daughter, 21-year-old Mary Jenkins Bienusa, also lived there with her husband Dean and their infant son, Dean Jr. 3 other Jenkins children had already moved out. Artis was married and living in Italy with her husband, Ben Salazar, who was stationed in the Army there. Son Leslie was in the Air Force and stationed in Hawaii, while 16-year-old Dennis was in the Job Corps in Nebraska. According to the Forum, the first person to notice the fire that night was Kathryn. She went downstairs just after midnight. She said she turned on the light, and fire suddenly erupted. The Jenkins son-in-law, Dean, started trying to put it out. He recalled later, "It was just a small fire when I started to fight it, but suddenly the whole room was on fire. I grabbed our baby and gave him to my wife and made sure they were outside." Dean Bienusa said he told his family, along with Kathryn, to take refuge from the flames in a black 1961 Ford parked outside. Eventually, the family, including a barefoot Kathryn, ran to the neighbor's house. Bienusa went back into the home and called out for his father-in-law. "I know he answered. I shouted real loud and then ran over to Mr. Kraft's," he said. William Kraft was the next-door neighbor. While Kraft put on a coat, he told his wife to call the fire department and ambulance. Then he helped Dean Bienusa carry a ladder back to Jenkins' house. They knew time was running out. Kraft said later, "I could hear Jenkins screaming for help, but the heat and the heavy smoke kept us from going all the way up the ladder to give him help." But Bienusa was not giving up. Still barefoot, he climbed to the window on the 2nd floor to try and rescue members of the family who hadn't been able to escape: Father Bernard, Mother Ellen, the 2 sons, Steve and Bruce, and little Evelyn. He said, "I broke the glass and hurt my hand. I couldn't see the window, and the next thing I knew, Evie was on the ground." In desperation, Bernard had thrown little Evelyn out the 2nd floor window, safely into a deep snowdrift below. He shouted, "I don't want her to die too." With Bienusa's hand now bleeding, Kraft tried again to climb the ladder. But he only got halfway up when the entire north wall of the home burst into flames. Even the ladder caught fire. By this time, firefighters had arrived. One told the Forum, "When we got there, it was impossible to save anyone." Kraft was deeply shaken when he spoke to a WDAY TV news crew the next day at the tool and supply store where he worked. He broke into tears as he told the story of Bernard's heroism and saving Evelyn's life. Kraft said after failing to rescue the family and feeling himself like a frozen, wet blanket, he turned his attention to the little girl in the snow. She was unconscious. He carried her to his house, where he and his wife wrapped her in blankets and waited for help. Kraft recalled later, she began to show life when the ambulance arrived. Evelyn was taken to St. Luke's Hospital and treated for exposure and minor burns. She was hospitalized for 3 days. Doctors had the grim news of telling her her parents and brothers were gone. After seeking refuge at the home of neighbors, the other survivors, Dean and Mary Bienusa, Dean Jr. and Kathryn Jenkins, were taken to the Garden Hotel in Fargo, where Dean treated his frostbitten feet. Investigators speculated that a portable heater was the probable cause of the fire. West Fargo Fire Chief Dwayne Jones said the electric heater is believed to have tipped over and ignited bedding in a first-floor bedroom. He added that the oil fumes from the space heater may have caused the whole room to come on fire after Kathryn had turned on that light switch. The survivors worked with the Red Cross to try and resume their lives following the tragic fire. They moved into a furnished apartment days after the fire. According to the form, the family's story obviously touched the community. This was written 2 days after the fire. Red Cross workers have been warned by the public's terrific current of humanitarian feeling for the family, as hundreds of calls offering aid of all kinds have poured in. John Welton, Red Cross Disaster Service Chairman, said people were offering furniture, bedding, clothing, and cash. But it was Evelyn's story that most touched some local police officers. The Fargo Police Association voted to spend $50 on Evelyn, and they issued a challenge to all other civic clubs in town to match it. On February 16th, a WDAY-TV news crew followed little Evelyn and representatives from the association on a shopping spree. The 8-year-old looked a little bewildered as to why her thumbing through a clothing rack of dresses was news. If you'd like to see this video, go to inform.com, and it's embedded within this story. According to the story in the form, the police said they just wanted to help the courageous little girl. A spokesperson said, "The pain of losing a father, mother, and 2 brothers is still very real for Evie. She got a big break when her dad saved her life. Fargo police hope she gets a real chance with that life." So where is Evelyn now? Evelyn Jenkins is now Evelyn Walters. She recently told the form that after the fire, she lived with her oldest sister Artis and her husband Ben. Sadly, Artis and Evelyn, the oldest and youngest Jenkins siblings, are the only ones still living. They stayed in Fargo, where Evelyn eventually graduated from Fargo North High School. Evelyn is a little reluctant to talk about the fire and her father's heroism because of the emotions it stirs up, calling that time in her life kind of a blur. But she was nice enough to provide assistance, information, and photos for this story. And it's a story that obviously struck a chord with people who read it 55 years ago. And some people never forgot it. The impetus for writing about the Jenkins fire and little Evie stemmed from a reader who mentioned to the forum that they always wondered what happened to that sweet little girl. That sweet little girl is now 63. She said perhaps in the future she'll be ready to talk more about surviving the fire. But for now, she can share that her story has a happy ending. She says, "I've been married for 42 years. I have 2 grown sons, and I am doing fine."